Hi, I'm Indre, the General Manager of Benelux region at Flexport. My experience lies in growing your supply chains and helping you navigate through challenges. And with me here today, we'll also have Chris.
Hi there, I'm Chris Rogers and I'm the supply chain economist for Flexport Research, our newly launched centre of expertise for economics and industrial supply chain analysis. I've worked in the supply chain, international trade, energy and financial research sectors for over 25 years. I'm going to kick off with a quick review of the state of EU trade.
So, Chris, we are 18 months into the pandemic at this stage. Has activity returned to normal yet?
Well, the answer is just about. The chart that we're showing you here is on a seasonal basis, and it shows the level of total import and export trade of goods for the European Union. Total EU trade, including that for EU member states with each other, as well as with the outside world, has increased by nearly 10% in July versus the same point of a year in 2019. In August, we've seen similar data, and we'd expect to see the same again in September. However, that's mostly been due to intra-EU trade. So EU trade is countries between each other. That's improved by around a fifth as the recovery means that the economy is beginning to get back to normal, even though we're still in the midst of the pandemic. Now, trade with the rest of the world has only really stabilized at 2019 levels. And that's largely been down to a drag in trade with the UK. That's obviously been due in part to Brexit, and that's offset the consumer goods driven boom in imports from Asia into the EU, particularly obviously from China, which has increased quite significantly as a result of demand for all kinds of goods. And we can get into some of that a little bit later on.
Yeah. And Chris, I'm guessing Brexit has been a bigger issue for UK trade than EU. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we take a look at the chart, the next chart here, that shows total UK trade, which is down by about a tenth versus pre-pandemic levels, while trade with the EU has actually fallen by nearly 15% over the same period running up to August. Aside from Brexit, we've also had trucking issues, we've had customs issues, which obviously are partly connected to Brexit, and we discussed that at length in our recent State of Trade webinar. But there's also fundamental issues which hopefully will clear in the coming months. Firstly, the automotive industry, which is obviously quite significant for the UK in particular, but global trade more generally, is facing this very widespread shortage of semiconductors. Secondly, the energy sector trade there has been distorted by a global shortage of natural gas, as well as a more generalized increase in raw material prices. And thirdly, the aerospace industry, which is obviously very important for cross-border trade within the EU, has yet to recover from the pandemic. Passenger travel remains depressed, and as a consequence of which the need for things like parts and new jets has been pretty suppressed as well. And actually, on the topic of passenger travel, I think that's been eating into air freight capacity as well. Indre, what are we seeing in terms of the situation for global activity and logistics at this stage?
Yeah, definitely. Your point is correct about air freight. And I think what we see, so we do see a lot of still congestion in the ports of Long Beach and LA. And while that actually has trickled down also to pretty much everywhere in the world, and we see the same in the rest of Europe. And I think what you see on the chart here on the right is that for the intra-Asia to Europe routes, our on-time performance for the industry has fallen below 25% overall. I think Chris will discuss some strategies on how to cope with that a bit later. So part of this fallout from the logistics issue has been higher shipping rates. Has that been feeding through to consumers?
Yeah, absolutely it has. We've got a chart here for you that shows the import price inflation to the 19 Eurozone countries. But it's not just elevated logistics costs. It's more widespread supply chain inflation. We've seen that, as I mentioned already, in terms of energy. We've seen it in terms of raw materials. And I think cost inflation, as I think many central bankers have expected, will prove transitory. But that doesn't mean that we'll see a correction by the end of this year. And in fact, we're likely to see costs of all sorts remain higher for longer. And a lot of consumer goods companies have begun to talk about price increases, not just of 2 or 3%, but in the 5 to 10% territory as well. And as a result, I think supply chain strategies are having to adapt to this kind of higher for longer situation, both in terms of costs and in terms of the prices that customers face. But I guess that's probably enough of where we are. I think people are listening to find out kind of where we're going. Now, I think going back to that first point about the state of trade, it looks like quite a large proportion of the surge in imports we've seen has been from China to meet consumer demand for goods. And I think one of the trends we've seen, obviously, over the past couple of years, and particularly during the pandemic, there's been a rise of direct-to-consumer retail. I guess, Indre, what are some of the successful strategies we've seen from companies pursuing direct-to-consumer trends during the pandemic?
Yeah, great question. And I think what we have seen, which definitely holds true, is that for direct-to-consumer companies that have invested in strategies to become more resilient, it has paid off. And I think three strategies that I've seen with some of our customers are as follows. So I think number one, which probably isn't a surprise to anyone, is increasing your inventory to then have higher capacity buffers in your distribution centers. Ultimately, what that means is you'll have shorter delays for your consumers in case when you ship via ocean, for example, you encounter delays at any point of the route. Second, diversifying manufacturing. And I think this comes not necessarily from doing it in different geographies, but at least doing it in different locations, even if it's within the same country or the same continent. This way, when shipping crises, which could be, for example, at origin, so with distribution warehouses or trucking, for example, across Asia, usually they're not hit at the same time. So, for example, if you are in multiple locations, then you can easily just sort of diversify. And I think third one, which you've alluded to also, is nearshoring. So I think with nearshoring, we'll talk a bit more later, but it's a very interesting strategy to make sure, especially for your best-selling products, to just have them on hand for your customer. Because I think the worst thing is just having empty shelves, be it online or in person for your customers.
Yeah, I think that's right. You certainly don't want empty shelves, but I guess the question is not just around kind of nearshoring, but it's whether to kind of keep sourcing from Asia at all, whether to move to the EU or whether to kind of follow a hybrid approach. Do you think we're seeing people already making those moves? Are they waiting and seeing? And so, I think, are they doing it? And, what are some of the considerations that maybe need to go into that nearshoring?
Yeah, so indeed, Chris, we're definitely seeing a trend. I think obviously with these types of moves, you cannot do them quickly. You want to make sure you find manufacturers and suppliers that meet your requirements as a customer. So I think we're seeing it sort of happen slowly, but definitely happen. But it is definitely a coin with two sides. And I think one of those sides is that whether, you will have more reliability, it will be closer. So you can definitely get the goods to wherever they need to be faster. But I think one of the key things is it is more expensive. And I think for a company, it really depends on how you look at the return on investment for these goods. I think what we're seeing is that companies will really make sure that, for example, for their best-selling product or maybe some of their higher value goods, they will look at nearshoring more so than, for example, for some of the rarer items or items that are maybe a bit cheaper.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess, the overall cost equations become particularly more important now that logistics has gotten quite expensive, to perhaps give an understatement, over the past couple of years. And maybe it's not just the absolute level of logistics costs that's become a challenge. It's also the volatility in that and the risk associated with that. And, I'm guessing, it's not just even the level of rates, but it's also, I guess, the risk of actually getting products where they need to be. You mentioned some of the figures around kind of delivery on time a little bit later on. And, I'm guessing that some of the trends that we've seen that used to take years have been compressed into a a handful of months, and that's difficult to maybe adapt to that change. Have we seen any of our customers perhaps successfully manage the logistics shift from a risk perspective?
Yeah. I mean, in reality, as much as we like to think that someone was way smarter than others, everyone was hit by surprise. And I think one of the groups of customers who at least manage financial risk well were those who signed 3 to 5 year deals very early on when the rates started hiking. So think about the first 6 to 9 months. I mean, we have seen that actually most of the carriers have honored these rates, and these customers are still shipping successfully. However, most of us didn't have that crystal ball, and it didn't seem like prices could go any higher, even though indexes like Seneta kept on climbing week over week. And then if we switch sort of from financial risk to performance risk, we've definitely seen more customers who have done well. And I think there, what really happened is these customers really tried to understand what in their supply chain needs to arrive when at destination. And I think there we saw customers really utilize different modes a lot more than before. So, instead of just doing maybe ocean or maybe a bit of ocean and air, we saw customers utilize rail. Utilize really air for more products that really had to hit the shelves on time. For example, for a product launch, you definitely don't want to miss that as a company. And for, even though the costs do seem high when you start looking at having multiple modalities in your supply chain, especially if you only used ocean freight before, we have seen that it has paid off because, as you mentioned before, consumer demand has only been increasing.
Yeah, sure. I think it's a great point. And I guess there's nothing as expensive as the sale that you don't make because the product wasn't there. One of the issues that certainly we've been looking at in our research, and I know has been an interesting trend more broadly within risk management, isn't just kind of managing the logistics risk. And of course, at Flexport, we're here to help our customers very directly with that. Is also kind of the phenomenon of trying to manage supplier risk. So, it may well be that you've got nice, smooth logistics, but if your upstream supplier's not there, or if they're facing their own challenges, that can be a problem, across the board. And, we've seen commentary from kind of, almost every sector, whether it's direct to consumer goods, whether it's hard lines like appliances or soft lines like apparel. We've seen it with food. We've obviously, as I've alluded to already, seen it with the automotive industry. Supplier risk and specific products is quite a widespread challenge. And I'm guessing there's a lot to handle here as well, right? Because we've had the COVID-19 outbreaks that have really hit suppliers, particularly in Southeast Asia, where we've seen factory closures. We've seen these specific parts shortages, including semiconductors, and of course this kind of shifting trade policy landscape that has kept economists like myself in business for the past couple of years. So there's no shortage of issues there, and we can get into policy a little bit later on. But I guess, Indre, have you seen strategies that have been particularly successful in terms of managing supplier risk?
Yeah, definitely, Chris. And I think here, sort of better safe than sorry holds more true than at any other time. I think customers who we have seen navigate this very well were really ones that employed advisors and really tried to understand what different options, do they actually have, and what does that mean for them. And then when they needed to do it, they would pull the plug and implement one of these strategies. But I think you do need that group of advisors to help you as a company, figure out what should you best do. And Chris, you mentioned trade policy risks. What are the hot button issues that we need to be keeping an eye out for?
Yeah, sure. I think the first point to make on that is that trade is global. That is a slightly trite statement, but it's to make the point that the issues that we see might well be bilateral between particular countries or particular groups of countries, but they can have knock-on effects across global supply chains. And quite obviously, aside from the regulatory issues, there are also geopolitical matters here as well. It's very easy to get kind of overawed by kind of how big some of these issues are, but it is, I think, relatively useful to try and break them down into specific areas. I think the first one and the biggest one that's really dominated the past 3 or 4 years and will continue to do so is the uncertainty around relations between the US and China. We are seeing a new round of engagement here. We've seen discussions between Secretary Yellen and her counterpart in China, talking about the potential to maybe de-escalate some of the tensions that we've seen. In theory, that could lead to a reduction in tariffs on shipments between the US and China, or at least a shift towards allowing exemptions from these tariffs going forward. The reason those tariffs matter, obviously, is that it's had an impact on how companies have structured their supply chains. We were talking about kind of offshoring and nearshoring earlier. That's led to a degree of increase in production in Vietnam, Malaysia, and other countries, which of course can have an impact on supplies into Europe if you're now competing with supplies into the US. So that distortion from tariffs is still there. We think it will remain there for some time, but it should begin to dissipate. There's also this kind of known as a phase one trade deal. Really, it was the only trade deal between the US and China. That may be extended. It's due to end at the end of this year, at the end of 2021. But I think that's probably a bit of a red herring for most global supply chains. It sounds important, but maybe less so. I think really it's whether the Biden administration is willing to take a new review of all of China's policies, particularly with regard to state aid for state-owned companies, that's going to be more important. And the reason that's more important, particularly if you are setting up business in Europe, is that the Biden administration is increasingly looking to draw allies such as Europe into its rivalry with China. And so that raises plenty of risks. On the other side of the coin, however, there are positive risks on the global side. And we're seeing that in terms of expanding free trade deals. Though much of the action, I think, will take place in and around Asia with the CPTPP trade deal that the US used to be a part of, and now China wants to join as well. Nearer to home, though, there's plenty of Brexit-related uncertainties to deal with, as we were talking about earlier. But of course, if we're talking about global trade, obviously, environmental related issues are beginning to feed into the overall kind of trade policy mix as well.
Yeah. And as you're right, Chris, so sort of Brexit seems like a well-established issue. Do you think there are any other policies that are coming in Europe that our customers should be more aware of?
Yeah, I think absolutely there are, Indre. And I think that point about the environment is where I would kind of start with that. You may have heard of the Fit for 55 program from the European Union. The plan there is to cut emissions of greenhouse gases by 55% in 2030 versus 1990, and then head towards being carbon neutral in the longer term. We discussed some of that recently at our Forward Global conference, but I think the biggest thing that you need to be thinking about if you're setting up business in Europe is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now, the purpose of that is to ensure that if there's goods coming in from outside the EU, that they're paying the same for their carbon emissions as European produced products would do. That's obviously going to increase costs, initially for industrial goods, but it'll also have a knock-on effect to consumer goods, which have a high content of either metals or building materials, where this will be implemented initially. Effectively, and it will be quite a complex process, and obviously at Flexport we'll be here to hold our customers' hands through this process, but it will in fact impose a form of tariff on imports from countries that have got weaker carbon trading schemes than the EU has. The Fit for 55 program is also going to add the shipping industry to the CO2 permit trading scheme. And that's going to increase costs for shipping as well, although we're not sure by how much. And we're also seeing increasing clean energy requirements and energy efficiency requirements for everything from retail stores to warehouses. I guess on that point, Indre, what I've been hearing from our customers in terms of them wanting to mitigate their carbon emissions already.
Yes, indeed. We do see increased interest from our customers to both understand what their emissions are and what could be the strategies to mitigate them. In fact, actually at Flexport, we have a team that can do both. So our platform measures every trade emission that you have as a company based on the mode that you ship. And we also offer to offset these emissions.
Sure. So I guess we've talked a lot so far about change, and there's been a lot of change in the past 18 months. Whether it's the pandemic or the rising costs or the logistics congestion, we've got the emergence of environmental issues to factor into supply chains. But we are seeing obviously a path to recovery, and change always brings opportunity as well as challenges. I think one of the challenges we've been asking ourselves about in Flexport research is whether corporate supply chain activities are going to go back to their old approaches once trade activity normalizes, or whether the opportunity of new business practices will begin to take a hold. I'd probably be inclined to think that some companies are going to imply the lessons learned. They're going to change and modernize their operations, perhaps using increased or more flexible inventory systems. But others maybe will yield to, frankly put, stockholder pressure and look to minimize their costs and maximize their profit. So I guess in that regard, we're only going to see, I think, parts of supply chains begin to head towards some sort of new normal in terms of operations. Is that something you'd agree with, Indra, or do you think it's going differently?
Yeah, definitely. And spot on. We really do see, I think at this moment, at least two camps forming. So one camp that's really willing to do what it takes to make sure that their supply chain is resilient and they can sort of keep on weathering the storm. And then we have a second camp that really still tries to go more opportunistically for better rates and succumb to this really shareholder pressure that they may feel due to supply chain costs that are rising. I mean, I do not have a crystal ball, but I do think that it's important to, understand that probably freight rates will not drop, at least in the very near future, to the levels we have seen before they started rising about 2 years ago. And I think sort of knowing that, I do believe that companies that invest in making their supply chain more resilient, who really make sure that they understand what modalities are best to use for them and what policies they should take more note of now, will actually be more successful in the coming years. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for joining us today. It was a great chat. And thank you for all of you who joined us today at Forward 21 Europe. Hope you join the remainder of the sessions today, and make sure you keep in touch with your Flexport representative. We are here for you, and we are here to help make your supply chain more resilient. Thank you.